Okay, so today's question, can science and God coexist? This is a fantastic question. It's a big question. And to tell you a bit about myself, I've alluded to it already. Studied a master's degree in zoology, particularly looking at ecotoxicological risk assessment. I like to just throw it out there, big words. That for me was something that I loved. I've continued to do a bit of work in that line, in that field, particularly looking at environmental risk and water quality. These little fellas are called diatoms. If you've ever seen those, that's a microscopic unicellular algae with a silica oxide cell wall called a frustule. They're beautiful little things. There's thousands and thousands of species, and what's awesome about these things is when you actually collect them from water sources out in nature, say you want to see what the impact is of a mine or some kind of industrial operation, you can use these little fellas and they tell you a whole lot about water quality parameters, the pH, the oxygen saturation, and really cool stuff about pollution. So this is what I've specialized in doing, and I absolutely love it, amongst other things that I do. But I remember when I was growing up, I used to sit outside and under the lovely African sky and look up at the stars, and I was always just moved to have this overwhelming sense of wonder. And the more I did that, my sense of tininess just grew and grew and grew. And it was, for me, the impression that there is more to life than what we just see in front of us. As I looked and that sense of wonder grew and grew, I was just more convinced of that. And I'm not the only one who has been moved to that. The scientist, the cosmologist Stephen Hawking said much the same. He said, all my life I've been fascinated by the big questions that face us, and I've tried to find scientific answers to them. And if, like me, you've looked up at the stars and tried to make sense of what you see, you too have started to wonder what makes the universe exist. Now he's not a Christian, he's not a theist, and so it's really fascinating to hear that coming from him. There's these big questions from a scientist like that, and he's not saying that science answers everything. There's still these big questions that remain. And further than that, I think the Bible pretty much pushes the same point that Stephen Hawking was making, and Psalm 19 says it so nicely: the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. By way of overview, I'm as fast as possible going to try and get through these 4 points. We're going to define terms. What do we mean when we're talking about these things? The limits of science, science and design, and science and then life's big questions. So what do we mean when we say science? What is science? It's the investigation of the natural world through various means of observation and experimentation. It's setting up hypotheses and testing them, and then either accepting or rejecting them or modifying them as we need to. That's pretty much it. That's a broad definition of science, and really all the sciences fit into that. It's a tool. It's a method of doing things. What do we mean when we say God? Now there's quite a bit of confusion on this sometimes, intentionally, unintentionally. People try and maybe skew this or just don't understand it. By way of illustration, when we were flying out here last week from South Africa, I thought I'd use my time very wisely and just watch movies for the whole flight. And so I started watching the new Thor movie. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but there's this section where Thor meets Zeus, played by Russell Crowe, in a really cool little cameo, and they end up having a little bit of a scuffle. But not to say more there, the point is that you have gods like Thor, and you have gods like Zeus, and that these are beings within the universe. And this is a very, very, very different idea compared to what a Christian would mean when they refer to God. For a Christian, God is the eternal supreme being who created and preserves all things. He's transcendent. That means wholly independent of and removed from the material universe, but is also at the same time immanent. That means involved with and closely working in the material universe. So, what then are the limits of science? If we say that science and God, or ask the question, can science and God coexist? If we're looking at these definitions, well, there's really no inherent contradiction. There's no problem. God exists immaterially, but science is a tool that by definition investigates the material world. So, God is not material. It's not like when I'm in the lab and there's an assistant and I say, I need 2 grams of God to be put into this test tube. God is an immaterial being. He doesn't lend himself to that kind of investigation. But science can indeed point to something beyond itself. But we need the tools of things like theology and philosophy when asking questions about God's presence and God's character in the world. So science is an extremely good tool. It's just very inadequate when it comes to answering certain kinds of questions. And I say this as a professional scientist. I love science, but it has its limits. So to make the point, perhaps in a different way, if you had to say to me, as many people did at university when they found out that I was someone who believed in God but was also studying science, they say, well, how can you be a scientist and believe in God? Surely these things don't match up. To me, that was in a way like saying, well, how can you read books and believe in authors? It's my reading of a book that actually points me to an existence of an author, a mind, an intelligent mind outside of that book. So, for example, my friend Andy here, who's doing the next talk, is a massive Lord of the Rings fan. He's written a bit on that, and they hold a very prime spot on his bookshelf. But if I had to go and say to Andy, after he's been reading about Frodo's fluffy feet and Gollum's precious, and I say to him, well, where's J.R.R. Tolkien in the book? Where is he? He'd probably look at me quite strangely and say, what do you mean? That it's, the question is a bit strange. Where he's not in the book. He's the author of the book. He's not a character in the story, but at the same time, he is everywhere in the story. He's behind every character. He's behind every single little bit of it. Every character, every scene, he's there. He thought it all into being, and essentially it's under his providence, as it were. So the point is this. As a scientist, read the book of nature, that is the natural world all around me, and I use this wonderful tool of science to do that, to read this book of nature, I'm similarly pointed to an author behind it, an intelligent mind behind the order, behind the beauty, and behind the sophistication of the world around me. So, that leads me to the next point, is that science really does help point us to a designer. An example of that would be the applicability of mathematics, as we heard just now, or for me, irreducible complexity was a really big one that did this for me. Something like the ATP synthase engine that sits within the cell wall. This is an extremely complicated thing that can't just evolve piece by piece. The whole thing has to exist or the cell doesn't work. So you can't have a cell before you have it. Very useful little thing. Or the fine-tuning of the universe. This is something, you have all these physical constants that are fine-tuned. They have to be within a very, very tiny range to permit life in the universe. I love what Fred Hoyle says about this, talking about this fine-tuning. He says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as the chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Fred Hoyle, also not a Christian, not someone who believes in God, and if you've ever heard the term Big Bang, Fred Hoyle is the one who coined that. So this guy, a giant in the scientific community, makes this point. So, is this just the way things are? Is it all accidental, blind chance? Or is there a better explanation? Is there something else behind it? Or is there perhaps an amazing intelligibility to the world that suggests there is actually a creative intelligence or intellect that has thought it all into being? Many of the scientists of old, the big, essentially the fathers of science, as it were, believed this. Before they started their scientific investigations, they went out searching for order in nature because they believed that there was an intelligence behind the universe. So, guys like astronomer Johannes Kepler, chemist Robert Boyle, or physicist Sir Isaac Newton. Without the contribution of these guys, we really just wouldn't have the scientific discipline as we have it today. They made an amazing contribution to science that we just can't overlook. Historian and philosopher Stephen Meyer says it this way: "It's no exaggeration to say that the Judeo-Christian worldview led to the advent of modern science." Now, what do I mean by that? The Judeo-Christian worldview. That is the Old Testament Judaism and the New Testament of the Bible, Christianity. So that gives you a worldview that suggests that there is a God behind the universe, a God who brought it all into being. And that is what led them to do their investigations. Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project, says, "One of the greatest tragedies of our time is this impression that has been created that science and religion have to be at war." Again, another amazing scientist saying, no, these things are different. They do different things. So, science doesn't answer the biggest questions of life. If I had to come into the kitchen and there's a wonderful cake sitting on the counter and ask, well, why is this beautiful cake sitting there on my kitchen counter? The chemist could come and have a look at it, all the molecular interactions and the constituents, and come up with an answer about that. The physicist could look at the structural aspects of it, keeping it together, but neither of them could answer the question, why? When in fact it's because my wife, who loves me so very, very much and thinks I'm just so fantastic, has baked me this lovely cake. That is a why. And science, the tools of science, cannot give you that answer. And so that is why when I say science doesn't answer the biggest questions, what I mean is questions of meaning, questions of value, questions of morality, what is right and wrong, and how do we actually have a solid basis for that, questions of purpose, what is the reason that we're here, why do I exist, and then identity, what does it mean to be humans, and each of those we can explore in depth, but those questions are not attended to by the tools of science. So we know this intuitively, we're more than just bits of matter. We know that people have value and purpose, and this is what Christianity tells us. So we learn real and deep truths about life from many other sources apart from the material sciences, and perhaps I would suggest actually the biggest questions of life aren't really answered by science. I love what Albert Einstein said. He says, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." And I really do have to agree with that in a strong way, because he's really onto something. Science has its place. It's a wonderful thing. But religion has its place too. God, the idea of God is something that we need to be able to answer those big questions of life. And so it was at my time at the University of Johannesburg, as I was really exploring these questions of science and faith, that I was going through the Bible, and I found in particular two verses that I thought were really, really good at sort of putting their finger on what I was already feeling intuitively as I went out and did my scientific investigations of the world. The first is Romans 1:20. It says, "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes," that's God's invisible attributes, "are clearly seen, being understood by the things that have been made." That is the material universe, and even His eternal power and Godhead. So what that verse means is that there's this created order, there's this world that we can see and touch and smell and taste, the world of sense, but it points to something. And through it we can actually start to come close to even understanding certain attributes of what God is like, if we would be open to following where the evidence goes, to seeing that science in fact points us to something beyond itself. And the second is that His purpose, from Acts 17, says His purpose for the nations is to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us. And I believe this as a Christian, as someone who believes in God, that God didn't just make the world for, whatever. He made the world for a reason, so that as we step out, as we investigate, as we seek to think God's thoughts after Him, we would actually be drawn toward Him, that we would seek and try to feel our way toward Him. So in a setting like this, for many of you maybe starting your studies, you've maybe been here for a little while, I would say it's my hope that you would be very, very, very critical in your thinking. And you wouldn't actually give in to this false idea that there's this insurmountable conflict between God and science, but rather as you look deeper and deeper into this fascinating and beautiful world that we live in, you would also just be filled again and again with this sense of wonder that would actually lead you to stretch out your mind and your heart toward God and feel your way toward Him. As a Christian would believe that God has actually done for us in the person of Jesus Christ, as He stepped out of heaven to come and find us in a broken and very difficult world. Sometimes God hasn't completely left us. He's given us the beauty of the world so that we would see it, that we would reach out to Him, and that we would actually come to know Him and find true identity and meaning and purpose. Thank you so much.